Hey friends, tonight we're diving together into the smoky, filthy, and surprisingly dangerous world of medieval taverns. These were legendary places where ale flowed freely, strangers became lifelong friends or mortal enemies, and the line between human society and complete chaos was thinner than watered-down beer. Forget everything you've seen in fantasy films and video games. A real medieval tavern was a place where survival meant far more than simply avoiding food poisoning. Get comfortable, and let's take this journey together. Picture London in the 14th century. You're walking through filthy streets where your feet squelch through a mixture of horse manure, rotting vegetables, and things better left unidentified. It's been raining for 3 days straight, turning every road into a river of filth. Your stomach growls with hunger, and your throat burns with a thirst that water alone won't satisfy. And then, in the distance, through the gray fog and smoke, you spot it. A wooden sign swaying in the wind, crudely painted with a boar's head or a bunch of grapes. Warm firelight spills from small windows, and through the heavy wooden door come laughter, shouting, and something that, with a generous imagination, you might call singing. You've found a tavern. And whether you realize it or not, you've just stepped into a world where entirely different rules apply, where fortunes of wealth and poverty are decided by a single roll of the dice, where the wrong word can earn you a knife between the ribs, and where the ale is quite possibly the cleanest thing you'll consume tonight. The medieval tavern was not merely a place for drinking. It was the most vibrant center of community life. An unofficial town council, marketplace, labor exchange, and entertainment venue all rolled into one smoky, chaotic, and astonishingly alive establishment. But it was also a place where diseases spread faster than gossip, where danger lurked in every shadow, and where a careless visitor could lose everything they owned before dawn. The first thing that hit you when entering a tavern was not sight or sound. It was smell, a complex bouquet of aromas that attacked the nostrils with blunt force. Imagine the concentrated essence of unwashed humanity, mixed with the sour reek of spilled ale, the acrid smoke of poorly ventilated hearths, and the mysterious but undeniable odor of things that had been fermenting in dark corners for far too long. The floor, if it could even be called that, was typically packed earth covered with a layer of rushes. In theory, these rushes were supposed to be changed regularly. In practice, they stayed for months, slowly becoming a rich ecosystem of decomposing organic matter, spilled drinks, and the remains of unfortunate rodents. Walking across such a floor was like navigating a soft, unpredictable landscape. Your foot might sink into an ale-soaked soft patch, or crunch on the bones of long-forgotten meals. Wealthier establishments might boast actual wooden floors, but even these were dark, with years of stains and scarred from countless knife fights, gambling disputes, and the general wear of serving as a stage for humanity's baser instincts. The walls, built from timber frames filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung, were black from smoke and grease. In winter, they sweated moisture. In summer, they radiated heat, creating a microclimate that was always uncomfortable. Crude paintings or carvings might decorate these walls, often depicting religious scenes, royal heraldry, or earthier pleasures, depending on the establishment's clientele. The ceiling completed the atmospheric experience. Low, oppressive, and blackened from decades of soot, it seemed to physically press down on the inhabitants. Massive wooden beams, often salvaged from old ships or hewn from ancient forests, supported the structure. From these beams hung all manner of objects: dried herbs, bundles of onions, cuts of bacon in various stages of preservation, and sometimes less pleasant reminders for customers who had left unpaid debts. Light came primarily from the great hearth that dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that made every face look sinister. Candles, when they could be afforded, provided additional light, but their flickering only heightened the unease. Smoke from the hearth and candles drifted upward, pooled beneath the low ceiling, and eventually found its way out through gaps in the thatched roof. In such an environment, every breath was an adventure. The air was so thick, it seemed you could chew it. Newcomers frequently coughed and gasped, their eyes watering, not from emotion, but from the simple effort of breathing. Yet despite all this assault on the senses, there was something undeniably alive about a medieval tavern. The air seemed to pulse with energy, that raw vitality people feel when living at the most basic, unguarded level. It was uncomfortable. It was dangerous. But it was never boring. As eyes adjusted to the dim light and lungs adapted to the thick air, the figures that populated this smoky underworld began to take shape. Merchants counting coins with suspicious eyes, soldiers not yet washed clean of the dirt from distant battlefields, pilgrims seeking shelter on their way to holy sites, craftsmen celebrating the completion of a difficult commission, and locals who seemed to have grown directly from the floorboards, so organically did they fit their surroundings. Every face told a story, and most of those stories were written in scars, missing teeth, and eyes that had seen too much. These were not the idealized peasants of romantic literature, but real people living real lives in an era when survival was never guaranteed and comfort was a luxury available to few. The tavern keeper, typically a heavy-set man of questionable morals, presided over this chaos like a king over his court. His word was law within these walls, and justice was swift and often brutal. He knew every customer's name, their debts, secrets, and weaknesses. He was part confessor, part moneylender, and part executioner, depending on what the situation demanded. His wife, if he had one, was equally formidable. She wielded a wooden spoon or rolling pin with the skill of a seasoned warrior. Not all medieval drinking establishments were the same, and understanding the subtle but critical distinctions between an inn, a tavern, and an alehouse could mean the difference between a comfortable night's rest and waking in a ditch with your purse gone and your head ringing. At the top of the hierarchy stood inns, the aristocrats of the hospitality world. These establishments catered primarily to travelers, offering not only food and drink, but actual beds, or at least something more resembling beds than a pile of straw. The finest inns were substantial buildings, often constructed of stone, with multiple floors and rooms capable of accommodating merchants, pilgrims, and other wayfarers. Even the best inns, however, had features that would shock a modern person. Privacy, as we understand it, simply did not exist. Travelers were regularly packed into rooms like cargo, 10 or 12 strangers sharing not only the same space, but often the same bed. The concept of individual accommodation was the preserve of the very wealthy. The beds themselves were masterpieces of medieval engineering and endurance. Constructed from ropes or leather straps on wooden frames, they supported mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or whatever organic material was available. These mattresses were rarely changed and never properly cleaned. They harbored entire ecosystems of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other creatures that regarded guests merely as a convenient food source. Sleeping with strangers was not merely uncomfortable but potentially dangerous. Theft was commonplace, as was violence born of disputes over space, snoring, or the various bodily functions people perform in their sleep. Food at inns was generally better than elsewhere, but that's a relative concept. The finest establishments might offer roasted meat, fresh bread, and ale brewed a few days prior. The worst served something that had once been an animal, alongside bread capable of serving as a weapon and ale that tasted suspiciously as though it had been filtered through a horse. Taverns occupied the middle ground in the medieval hospitality hierarchy. Originally, these establishments were the domain of wine merchants selling their product directly to the public. Wine was expensive, imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine region, and carried with it an aura of refinement unavailable to ale. A gallon of decent Gascon red wine might cost 3 pence, twice the price of the finest ale, while Rhine wine could run to 6 or 8 pence per gallon. The wine trade was strictly regulated, and not without reason. Fraud was widespread. Unscrupulous tavern keepers diluted wine, blended it with cheaper varieties, or created entirely counterfeit versions from whatever came to hand. Punishment for such deception was severe and public. A tavern keeper caught adulterating wine might be locked in the stocks and have the falsified drink poured over his head, a form of punishment that combined public humiliation with poetic justice. To combat fraud, customers had the right to inspect the wine they were purchasing. A suspicious buyer could demand to be taken to the cellar and shown the barrel from which their wine was being drawn. This practice led to the development of elaborate underground cellars beneath many taverns, cool subterranean spaces where wine could be stored and aged. As they developed, taverns began expanding their offerings beyond wine. Apple cider, pear cider, and mead found their way onto the menu. Some establishments began offering food as well, recognizing that a hungry customer is a thirsty customer. Alehouses sat at the bottom of the hospitality hierarchy, modest establishments that began as private homes where the mistress brewed more ale than the family could drink. These women, known as alewives, signaled the availability of fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom by the entrance, a simple but effective form of medieval advertising. Ale was the lifeblood of medieval society, drunk by everyone from infants to the elderly, since it was often safer than water. The brewing process, which required boiling water and produced ethanol, killed many of the harmful bacteria that threatened life when consuming untreated water. The quality of ale varied considerably between alewives. Some took pride in their craft, producing clear, flavorsome, and properly fermented ale. Others were less conscientious, selling weak, sour, or contaminated drink. Bread dough, herbs, and even less appetizing additives might find their way into a batch of ale, accidentally or deliberately. Despite their humble origins, alehouses were subject to strict regulation. The assize of bread and ale of 1266 tied the price of ale to the price of wheat and established quality standards that all brewers were required to follow. Ale tasters, officials whose duty was to sample ale and ensure its quality, regularly visited alehouses to test the product. Punishments for poor ale or inflated prices were severe and public. But alehouses offered more than just drink. They were social centers where news was exchanged, gossip spread, and deals struck. A successful alewife could find herself at the center of her community's social network, knowing the secrets and scandals capable of raising or ruining reputations. In a world where water could kill you faster than an enemy, alcohol was not a luxury. It was a necessity of life. The medieval attitude toward drinking was fundamentally different from our modern understanding, shaped by practical considerations that made sobriety not merely unpleasant, but potentially deadly. Water, the most basic human need, was often the most dangerous thing you could put to your lips. Rivers served simultaneously as roads, sewers, and rubbish dumps. The Thames in London was a mixture of human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works, and the general refuse of urban life. Wells, where they existed, were frequently contaminated by seepage from neighboring cesspits or churchyards. Even rainwater collected in barrels and cisterns quickly became a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. The solution was alcohol. The brewing and fermentation process, which required boiling water and produced ethanol, destroyed most harmful microorganisms. This was not understood in scientific terms. Germ theory would not emerge for centuries. But the practical effect was unmistakable. People who drank ale, wine, or other fermented beverages fell ill less often from mysterious stomach ailments. This created a society where alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death. Infants were given weak ale or diluted wine. Children drank small ale, a low-alcohol beverage that provided calories and hydration without intoxication. Brewing ale was predominantly women's work, a domestic skill passed from mother to daughter, like cooking or weaving. An alewife's reputation depended on her ability to produce consistent, flavorsome ale that kept her family and customers healthy. The process was simultaneously art and science, requiring knowledge of grain quality, water sources, fermentation times, and dozens of variables that could turn a promising batch into undrinkable swill. The basic ingredients were simple: malted barley, water, and thyme. Barley was soaked until it germinated, then dried to halt the sprouting. This malting process converted the grain's starches into fermentable sugars. The malted barley was then mashed with hot water, extracting these sugars and creating a sweet liquid called wort. Wild yeasts in the air began fermentation naturally, converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Hops, which would later become indispensable in brewing, were not widely adopted in England until the 15th century. Before that, brewers relied on a blend of herbs and spices, called gruit, to flavor ale and extend its shelf life. Bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, and dozens of other plants might be added for distinctive flavor. Some of these additives had psychotropic properties, lending the ale drinking experience an additional dimension unavailable in modern beer. The result was a drink bearing little resemblance to modern beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, often thick enough to chew, with a complex flavor profile incorporating notes of herbs, spices, and whatever the brewer decided to add. It was typically consumed within a few days of brewing before it turned sour or developed off flavors. Alcohol content varied widely, from the weak, small beer given to children to strong varieties capable of felling a grown man. Wine occupied a different niche in medieval society. If ale was the drink of common people, wine carried connotations of refinement, wealth, and religious significance. Its use in Christian communion gave it a sacred quality. In England, Wine came primarily from continental territories and trading partners. Gascon wine from southwestern France was the most common, a red wine, relatively affordable, and capable of surviving transport. Rhine wine from the German regions along the Rhine commanded higher prices. Spanish and Portuguese wines were exotic luxuries, while sweet wines from Greece and the eastern Mediterranean were for the very wealthy. The wine trade was international commerce in all its complexity. Merchants had to overcome not only the physical challenges of transportation — wine might spoil, freeze, or turn to vinegar on a long journey — but also the political and economic obstacles of wars, tariffs, and trade disputes. Wine merchants, vintners, were among the wealthiest and most influential members of medieval society. Mead, made from fermented honey, occupied a special place in medieval drinking culture. Often called the drink of the gods, mead was associated with celebrations, ceremonies, and the warrior culture of earlier eras. It was expensive to produce. Honey was a valuable commodity used for sweetening, medicine, and candle making. But its intoxicating properties and symbolic significance made it worth its price for special occasions. Cider and perry were regional specialties, reflecting local agriculture and preferences. In areas where apple orchards thrived, cider might be more common than ale. The finest ciders were made from specific apple varieties bred for fermentation quality rather than eating qualities, often small, tart, and inedible fresh, but yielding drinks of remarkable complexity and strength. If the drinks in medieval taverns were questionable, the food was often outright dangerous. Nevertheless, for many people, particularly those living in cities, a tavern meal was their primary source of hot, cooked food. The signature dish of taverns was pottage, a thick stew that could contain almost anything edible, and quite a bit that wasn't. The concept was simple. Take a large cauldron, fill it with water or broth, add whatever is available, and cook until everything is soft enough. The result was a dish that changed daily, sometimes hourly, as new ingredients were added to replace those consumed. The so-called eternal stew, or hunter's pot, was the quintessence of this philosophy. The cauldron perpetually simmered, new ingredients added as old ones were eaten. In theory, this created a continuously evolving dish that never ran out and never repeated exactly. In practice, it created a bacterial breeding ground and a repository of ingredients of dubious origin and questionable freshness. The base of most pottages was grain: barley, oats, wheat, or whatever was cheapest and most available. This provided bulk and calories. Vegetables were added as available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots, and whatever could be found at market or gathered locally. Meat, when it appeared in the pottage, was often of dubious origin and questionable quality. Beef, pork, mutton, and chicken were most common, but rabbit, venison, and other game might also find their way into the pot. Tavern keepers had no qualms about using meat rejected by other buyers, animals that had died of disease, or cuts that had sat unsold at market for several days. Long cooking killed most harmful bacteria, but could not eliminate the off flavors and texture of spoiled meat. Fish was another common ingredient, especially during Lent and other periods when the Church prohibited meat consumption. But medieval preservation methods were primitive, and fish that had traveled any distance from the sea was likely heavily salted, dried, or fermented. Seasonings reflected both availability and affordability. Salt was expensive and heavily taxed, a valuable commodity used sparingly. Herbs, parsley, thyme, sage were added as available. Spices were largely inaccessible to most tavern keepers. Bread was another staple of tavern meals, but its quality varied enormously. The finest taverns might offer white wheat bread, soft, flavorful, and relatively fresh. More commonly, customers received brown bread of barley, rye, or mixed grains, often several days old and hard enough to serve as a weapon. The worst bread was made from whatever was cheapest, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers. This bread was frequently used as a plate, the so-called trencher, upon which other food was placed. Cheese was another common offering, from fresh, soft varieties that needed to be eaten quickly to aged hard cheeses that could keep for months. Quality depended on the source. Eggs, when available, were a welcome addition to the tavern menu. But eggs were perishable, and without refrigeration, it was difficult to distinguish fresh from spoiled until it was broken open. Food preparation in medieval taverns was a communal affair, with multiple dishes prepared simultaneously in a single kitchen space. Cross-contamination was inevitable. The same utensils, cutting boards, and work surfaces were used for different ingredients without proper cleaning between uses. Raw meat might be handled on the same surface as bread. Vegetables might be washed in the same water used to clean dishes. Food service was as haphazard as its preparation. Dishes were frequently shared among several customers, everyone eating from a single bowl or platter. Personal hygiene was low, the concept of individual utensils unknown. Customers ate with their hands, shared knives, and drank from communal cups, spreading disease and parasites with every meal. Merchants were among the most conspicuous and boisterous regulars in any tavern. These people, and they were almost exclusively men, traveled dangerous roads between cities, carrying goods, news, and often considerable sums of coin. They were natural storytellers. But beneath their good-natured exterior lurked a sharp mind, constantly calculating profit and loss. A successful merchant in a medieval tavern was like a walking advertisement for prosperity. But that display of wealth made him a target for every pickpocket, swindler, and outright robber in the establishment. Less successful merchants were often more dangerous than their prosperous counterparts. Desperate people with failing businesses, mounting debts, and families to support were capable of anything. Soldiers were another common sight in medieval taverns, and their presence could either ensure peace or guarantee disorder, depending on their mood, sobriety, and recent experiences. Veterans of foreign wars brought with them not only scars and stories, but a matter-of-fact attitude toward violence, capable of turning a simple argument into a bloodbath. The best soldiers were disciplined professionals. The worst, deserters, discharged veterans with no other skills, and mercenaries between contracts, frequently turned to crime to survive. Pilgrims presented a different kind of danger. These ostensibly holy travelers were often the most worldly people in the tavern. The Canterbury Tales gives us a vivid picture of medieval pilgrims, and it is not always flattering. Chaucer's characters include a corrupt pardoner selling fake relics and the wife of Bath, who had buried 5 husbands and was looking for a 6th. Craftsmen and tradesmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, and representatives of dozens of other guilds formed the backbone of the medieval economy. Guild membership gave craftsmen a certain status and protection, but also bred rivalry and conflict. The most dangerous craftsmen were those expelled from guilds or practicing their trade without proper authorization. These men had skills but no legal way to apply them, and became natural recruits for the criminal underworld. The clergy appeared in medieval taverns with surprising frequency, despite the church's official condemnation. Parish priests, wandering monks, and minor church officials often found themselves in taverns, by necessity or by choice. The corrupt cleric was a stock character of medieval literature, but he was a real presence in medieval taverns. Women in medieval taverns occupied a complex and often dangerous position. Alewives who ran many establishments were entrepreneurs in their own right. Serving girls faced constant harassment and the threat of sexual violence. Prostitutes operated in a legal gray zone. But medieval women were not passive victims. Many were skilled with knives, poisons, and other weapons, and were often more ruthless than their male counterparts when threatened. Thieves and pickpockets were the most obvious criminals in any tavern. The best thieves were indistinguishable from honest merchants, craftsmen, or travelers, until the moment they struck. Professional thieves often worked in teams, one distracting attention while another emptied purses. They might pose as fellow travelers, sympathetic listeners, or potential business partners to get close to a victim. The tavern keeper himself was often the most dangerous man in the establishment. He controlled the environment, knew all the customers, and had the authority to settle disputes or call the local authorities. But he was also an entrepreneur operating in a legal gray zone. A corrupt tavern keeper might fence stolen goods, provide alibis for criminals, or arrange the removal of inconvenient customers. In the flickering candlelight of medieval taverns, fortunes were won and lost on the roll of dice, the turn of a card, or the outcome of contests testing both skill and luck. Gambling was not merely entertainment. It was a way of life, a means of social advancement, and often a path to ruin that claimed victims from every layer of society. Dice were the most popular gambling implements in medieval taverns. They were small, portable, and could be made from readily available materials, bone, wood, or stone. The most common dice game was hazard, the forerunner of modern craps, involving bets on the outcome of two rolls. Simple enough in concept, but the betting possibilities were endless. Side wagers on individual rolls, runs of rolls, and other players' outcomes created a complex web of financial obligations, capable of ruining a man in minutes. But hazard was only one of dozens of dice games played in medieval taverns. There was raffle, in which players tried to roll matching numbers on 3 dice. There was the dumb game, so dependent on luck that it became synonymous with random fate. There was passage, where players bet on whether they could roll doubles with 2 dice. The dice themselves were often works of art, carved from the bones of exotic animals, or made from valuable materials like ivory or jet. But regardless of construction, all dice were under suspicion. Loaded dice, shaved dice, and dice with repeated numbers were common. The most skilled dice players were those who could cheat without being caught. Cards, though less common than dice, gained popularity throughout the late Middle Ages. Early playing cards were hand-painted works of art, too expensive for widespread use, but by the 14th century, printed cards were becoming increasingly affordable. Beyond dice and cards, Medieval taverns hosted all manner of gambling events, arm wrestling, drinking contests, and tests of skill or knowledge all became occasions for wagering. Customers might bet on which of two flies would reach the ceiling first, or how many beans were in a jar. Cockfighting was especially popular in taverns with open space. Two specially bred and trained roosters were placed in a pit while spectators placed bets. The fights were brutal and often ended in the death of one or both birds. Bear baiting and bull baiting were less common, but even more spectacular. A bear or bull was chained to a post and specially trained dogs set upon it, while spectators bet on various aspects of the contest. The social dynamics of gambling in medieval taverns were complex and often dangerous. Winning too much too quickly meant being branded a cheat or becoming a target for robbers. Losing too much could lead to desperate attempts to recover losses, frequently ending in violence or crime. The Church officially condemned gambling as a sin, but this prohibition was widely ignored, including by the clergy. Local authorities took a more pragmatic approach, recognizing that eliminating gambling entirely was impossible and focusing instead on regulation. The psychology of gambling in medieval taverns was shaped by the harsh realities of life. For most people, life was a relentless struggle with poverty, disease, and early death. Gambling provided an opportunity, however illusory, to escape those bonds with a single lucky roll of the dice. It was a form of hope, however irrational, that tomorrow might be better than today. Violence in the medieval tavern was not an aberration. It was an integral part of the social fabric. In a world where strength often determined right and personal honor was valued above life, the tavern served simultaneously as a pressure valve and a proving ground for aggressive impulses. Honor was the currency of medieval society, and it could be devalued by a single moment of perceived cowardice or disrespect. A man who allowed himself to be insulted without responding could permanently damage his reputation, affecting his business opportunities, marriage prospects, and the respect of his peers. Weapons in medieval taverns were restricted by law and custom, but ingenuity and desperation could turn almost anything into an instrument of death. Knives were the most common weapon, carried by almost everyone. These were not the small table knives of our time, but substantial blades capable of inflicting serious injuries. A skilled knife fighter could kill an opponent in seconds, while even an unskilled one could cause considerable damage in the cramped confines of a crowded tavern. Swords appeared in taverns less frequently, partly because they were expensive, partly because they were often restricted by law to members of the nobility and military. But when swords did appear in tavern brawls, the results were typically impressive and bloody. More often, people resorted to improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, shards of pottery became cutting tools, and even cutlery could be adapted as weapons. Heavy pewter or wooden ale mugs were particularly effective as cudgels. The fighting style in medieval taverns was brutal and practical, aimed at quickly ending the conflict. Grappling, biting, eye-gouging, and kicks were all acceptable tactics, and fighters frequently targeted vulnerable spots: eyes, throat, and groin. The goal was not to wound or disable an opponent, but to kill or neutralize him before he did the same to you. Group brawls were particularly chaotic and dangerous. What might start as a dispute between two people quickly escalated into a general melee involving dozens. alliances formed and dissolved in seconds, participants choosing sides based on personal connections, ethnic solidarity, or simple proximity to the action. The role of women in tavern violence was complex and often underestimated. Though women less frequently engaged in direct physical confrontation, they were often the instigators of violence, manipulating conflicts to serve their own interests. When women did engage in physical confrontation, they were often more vicious and unpredictable than their male counterparts. The consequences of tavern violence were often as dangerous as the violence itself. The wounded might die of their injuries days or weeks later. The families and friends of the slain might seek revenge, creating cycles of violence capable of lasting for generations. Legal authorities might intervene, leading to trials, executions, or other forms of official punishment. Medical care for victims of tavern violence was primitive and often more dangerous than the original injuries. Wounds might be washed with wine or vinegar, sewn up with available thread, and treated with herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness. Broken bones were set without anesthesia, amputations performed with crude instruments, and no concept of antiseptics. In the dark corners and upper-floor rooms of medieval taverns, another of the world's oldest professions conducted its business with a mixture of desperation, cunning, and resigned acceptance of society's moral contradictions. Prostitution in medieval taverns was not merely tolerated, it was often an integral part of the business model. Women who worked as prostitutes in medieval taverns came from various walks of life, though poverty was the common thread running through their stories. Some were widows who had lost husbands to war, disease, or accident, and had no other means of support. Others were young women who had been seduced and abandoned, their reputations destroyed, and their hopes of marriage shattered. The Church officially condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, but even religious authorities acknowledged its practical necessity. St. Augustine argued that prostitution was like sewers in a palace, unpleasant, but necessary to prevent something worse. In some cities, prostitution was entirely legal and regulated by municipal authorities. Licensed brothels operated openly, their workers undergoing regular medical examinations. In taverns, the situation was more ambiguous. Prostitution might be tolerated as long as it remained inconspicuous, or officially prohibited while being unofficially encouraged. Tavern keepers balanced maximizing profit against avoiding legal trouble. Working conditions for prostitutes in medieval taverns were harsh and dangerous. They had little protection from violent or cruel clients, no recourse when clients refused to pay, and constant exposure to venereal diseases capable of disfiguring or killing. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard, and the primitive contraceptive and abortion methods of the era were often more dangerous than childbirth itself. The economic arrangements between prostitutes and tavern keepers varied widely. Some women worked as independent contractors, renting rooms and keeping most of their earnings. Others were effectively employees, receiving a percentage of their fees while the tavern keeper provided accommodation and protection. The harshest situations involved women in effective slavery, held by debt, violence, or legal restrictions that prevented them from leaving. Customers seeking the services of tavern prostitutes were as varied as the women who served them. Merchants far from home, soldiers on leave, craftsmen celebrating successful deals, and locals seeking variety all contributed to the demand for commercial sex. Prostitution in medieval taverns was not only about sex. It was about company, entertainment, and emotional connection. Many clients were lonely men far from home who valued conversation and affection no less than physical satisfaction. Successful prostitutes learned to be actresses, therapists, and confidants, as well as sexual partners, adapting their personalities to the emotional needs of their clients. The health risks associated with prostitution in medieval times were enormous. Venereal diseases were common and often deadly. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections could cause blindness, madness, and death. Pregnancy and childbirth carried their own substantial risks. Violence was a constant threat. Despite these hardships, some prostitutes managed to achieve a degree of success and independence. The most skilled and fortunate could accumulate enough money to retire from active prostitution and become madams, managing other women. Justice in medieval taverns was a complex and often contradictory affair, where official law enforcement competed with informal systems of order, and the line between legitimate authority and criminal enterprise was frequently blurred beyond recognition. The most visible representatives of official law enforcement were constables, bailiffs, and other officials responsible for maintaining order in their districts. These men were often part-time officials who combined law enforcement duties with other occupations, and their effectiveness varied considerably depending on personal courage, political connections, and financial resources. The powers of these officials were broad in theory, but limited in practice. They could arrest suspects, confiscate property, and impose fines for various offenses. But their ability to exercise these powers depended on their personal authority and the support of the local community. Corruption was endemic in medieval law enforcement, and taverns were simultaneously a source of and a target for corruption. Officials might accept bribes to ignore illegal activities, participate in the proceeds of criminal enterprises, or use their position to extort tavern keepers and customers. Tavern keepers might pay protection money, provide free food and drink to curry favor with officials, or offer sexual services as payment. The church had its own law enforcement system, parallel to the secular authorities. Canon law regulated many aspects of medieval life, including marriage, sexual behavior, and religious observance, and church officials had powers to investigate and punish violations of those laws. The most effective form of law and order in medieval taverns was often the informal system of social control exercised by the keeper and regular customers. A strong tavern keeper could maintain order through a combination of personal authority, physical intimidation, and economic incentives. The legal procedures used to prosecute crimes committed in medieval taverns were often crude and unreliable by modern standards. Witness testimony could be distorted by personal connections, financial incentives, or simple fear. An accused person might be required to undergo various forms of trial, judicial combat, trial by fire or water, which were believed to reveal God's judgment on guilt or innocence. Punishments, assigned for crimes committed in medieval taverns, were designed to serve several purposes: deterrence, retribution, and public spectacle. Public executions, floggings, and other forms of corporal punishment were commonplace, often conducted in market squares and other public places where large crowds could gather. When dawn painted the sky in gray and gold, the taverns that had pulsed with life throughout the night began slowly returning to some semblance of respectability. But the evidence of the previous evening remained, like smoke in the rafters, bloodstains on the floor, broken furniture in the corners, the glassy stare of those who had gambled away their futures on a card turn or roll of dice. Morning was when the true cost of tavern life was revealed. Bodies needed to be removed, some merely unconscious from drink, others silenced forever by violence. Debts needed to be collected or forgiven, depending on the debtor's ability to pay and the creditor's willingness to show mercy. Reputations needed to be rebuilt or buried, as rumors of the night's events rippled through the community like rings on water. For the tavern keeper, morning brought the grim arithmetic of profit and loss. How much had been earned from food, drink, and other services? How much lost to theft, damage, and unpaid bills? How many customers gained or lost as a result of the previous night's events? The successful tavern keeper was one who could balance these competing factors, maintaining the delicate ecosystem that made his establishment profitable. The cleanup process was simultaneously physical and social. Floors needed sweeping, furniture repairing, supplies replenishing. But more importantly, relationships needed mending, alliances renegotiating, and the complex web of obligations and expectations that held the tavern community together needed reweaving. A fight between two regular customers might require weeks of careful diplomacy to settle. The women who worked in the tavern, whether as serving girls, cooks, or prostitutes, faced their own challenges in the morning light. Bruises needed concealing, torn clothing repairing, and the psychological wounds of the night's encounters somehow processed and filed away. Customers who had survived the night faced their own reckonings. Merchants assessed whether their business dealings had been profitable or catastrophic. Soldiers determined whether their reputations had been strengthened or undermined by their actions. Craftsmen returned to their workshops and tried to focus on their trades despite hangovers, injuries, and the after effects of substances consumed. The economic reckoning was the most immediate and tangible. Debts accumulated during a night of gambling or drinking had to be repaid, often with interest and penalties that quickly spiraled out of control. Gambling debts presented a particular problem since they were often not legally enforceable, leading to the development of informal enforcement mechanisms, threats, violence, and social ostracism, often more effective than legal remedies, but far more dangerous for all involved. And the cycle continued. Each evening brought new customers seeking the same things as their predecessors: food, drink, company, excitement, and the possibility of changing their circumstances with a single lucky roll of the dice or turn of a card. Each morning brought the same reckonings, the same attempts to make sense of what had happened and prepare for what lay ahead. The medieval tavern was simultaneously the best and worst of its world, a place of genuine community and brutal exploitation, a place of authentic human connection and calculated manipulation, a place of liberation from social constraints and enslavement to human weaknesses. The legacy of medieval tavern culture extends far beyond the Middle Ages itself. The institutions, practices, and social relationships that developed in these establishments influenced the development of the modern hospitality industry, entertainment venues, and public spaces. The tensions between regulation and freedom, morality and necessity, order and chaos that characterized medieval taverns continue to shape debates about social policy and individual freedom to this day. But perhaps the most important legacy of medieval tavern culture is its reminder of the complexity and contradictions of human nature. The same people capable of great cruelty in the tavern environment were capable of great kindness. The same institutions that fostered crime and vice also provided community and support for those who had nowhere else to turn. The medieval tavern was a mirror that reflected both the best and worst of human society, a place where the veneer of civilization was stripped away, exposing raw humanity, with all its beauty and ugliness, greatness and baseness, capacity both to create and destroy. The tavern door closes for the last time. The fire burns down to embers, and the last customer stumbles out into the dawn air. But the stories continue, passed from generation to generation, reminding us that in every era, in every society, there are places where human drama plays out in all its fullness. The medieval tavern may have passed into history, but its spirit lives on. Every time people gather to share food, drink, stories, and the fundamental human experience of being present in a world that is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, full of hope and despair. Perhaps this is the ultimate truth about medieval taverns, not that they were simply dens of vice or community centers, but that they were profoundly human institutions, reflecting the full complexity of the human condition. Places where people came to be themselves, for better or for worse. And in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to resonate in everyone who has ever sought refuge from the world in the company of strangers who might, just for a moment, become friends. Thanks for watching. If this video interested you, share it and leave a comment. See you in the next video.